Jesus carried with him the hopes of God. This is how he'd come to see it anyway, searching the scriptures, sucking the marrow of wisdom from the very bones of his faith. That God had spent everything to try and create community with his beloved, that is, with us. This sophisticated ape that struts on its hind legs and has dominion over all the world, as if he or she were a god, and yet frail and fallen, a creature, not a creator, still bearing God's image. God had spent everything, through covenants, through prophets, everything except himself. And now when all was exhausted, except the love from which this world was made, and which still ached to include within the circle of love that beloved humanity which bore God's mark. There was only one way left: to communicate love in the only language that human beings really understand, the language of human life. And it was his life, in his death, that this new covenant would be spoken. This is my servant whom I'm well pleased. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. These words from the Father that he carried to sustain him, the belief and the conviction that God was at work reconciling him to the world and to himself. And he carried the knowledge that this vocation had not arrived in his lap fully formed, but had been worked out and fought against over many years, nearly 30. And now it was no longer about what he said, though there were still so many things that he longed to say. It was no longer about the signs and the wonders that he performed, though he longed to bring comfort and healing to the confusion and the pain that he encountered everywhere that he went, in every human heart. Now it was just about what he did, about carrying his body to the cross on this Friday afternoon and submitting to the malevolence and the hatred that would be inflicted upon him. When he had first begun in his ministry, John the Baptist had said of him, "Look, here is the Lamb of God." These words had hit him hard, and he'd carried them with him. And now he realized what they meant. He saw it in all the painful detail. God was making good the promise to Abraham. A lamb for the slaughter was provided. All that he had to do now was be that slaughtered lamb whose shed blood saves. And as his forebears had painted the blood of the Passover lamb on the lintels of their doors to ward off approaching death, so the blood poured out on the lintel of this wood, this door between life and death, would save. And then there would be no more goats or pigeons sliced open, no more entrails burnt, no more the terrifying grip of death upon everything and the endless pleading for mercy from a God made in his own image. Pressed into the self-same straitjacket of anxiety that we're cursed with, knowing our nakedness, we could never find enough clothes to wear. Now there would be no more need for any more blood spilled. Oh yes, we would spill blood, we like nothing more. But there would never be any need again, nor would anyone ever be pressed into knowing it. The last sacrifice would really be the end of all that. And seeing into the future, carrying all that was to come, he saw for one horrifying moment the elaborate intricacies of how he would butcher the world in the name of this carpenter. How he would dedicate walls of honor to the man who came to break them down. But now, carrying himself into the inner sanctum, he saw it clearly. It would no longer be necessary for priests to go into the temple year by year to plead to God on humanity's behalf. There would be no more barriers protecting God's presence and keeping us out. No more systems deciding who has favour with God and who doesn't. This blood will be shed for all. It will be the end of it. He carries to the cross every person and every person's death. For now, every person's death will be the only entrance qualification required. There won't be any other rules. There will be only him, nailed down, lifted up, a shining light through the darkness of death to a banquet where the least and the lost are ushered into the finest seats. And with this, he carried all the world and lovely hopes of God. He carried the possibility of a new temple, of a new covenant, and a new relationship. And beyond death, and beyond the rest is beyond death, he saw a new creation, a new heaven, and a new earth. It was as if he were carrying a great table into the banqueting room and planting it in the centre of the room and pulling the chairs around the table, chair after chair, place after place. A vast multitude of places and everyone known. No anonymity here in this place. Each was separate, a set place for everyone. And each was connected. Round and round the table they would sit, each honoured, each reaching out to serve. Can you conceive it? Every person carried and every person's death. His heart would break from it. Our minds would reel from it. Our common sense would deny it. But while there's a scrap of possibility that I might find a bit more love in my own feeble heart, then surely his heart, fashioned by the heart of God, still beating, can accommodate. And he carried a new commandment that could be seen in that giving of love that grew around that table. We should love one another with the same love that we see in him. We should expand the dimensions of our heart. We should let them be filled. For in him, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. For he'd also planted a table on earth, one that would abide until through the portals of death we take our place at that table in that new creation. A table where feet are washed, where hearts are fed, a place of receiving, a place to learn from. Yes, Peter had been there, and so had Judas. They'd received the bread, they'd had their feet washed, their hearts were expanded. Love one another as I've loved you. Love your enemies as you love yourself. Pray for those who persecute you. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. If someone asks you for a coat, give them your cloak as well. If anyone strikes you on one cheek, let them strike you on the other cheek. If they force you to walk 1 mile, walk a 2nd mile as well. This was what he was walking now, the 2nd mile of love. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, and yet he never opened his mouth. Like a lamb to the slaughter, like a sheep before its shearers, he's silent. He didn't open his mouth. He carried the determination of this new commandment and that it should be lived out, demonstrated here in his dying, no matter how difficult it was. This was the moment of disclosure where the risky enterprise of tenacious love would stand or fall. All God's hopes, all God's purposes are poured into these hours of passion. There's no fallback position. There's no plan B. So he forgave those whose dismal duty it was to bang home those nails. He looked with mercy upon those who spat and scoffed and struck out. Not because it was a duty laid upon him, but because he carried in his heart the ways of love. There was no other way. And again, he falls. It's as if he's always falling, dropping through the air, falling through the earth itself, burrowing down into the very depths of depth. How far must he go before everyone is gathered in his arms? Has he got to go to hell itself? So for the last part of the journey, someone else is dragged from the crowd. They are going to help shoulder the weight of the cross. And we shudder, fearful that we might be asked to do the same.